every once in a while, I'll learn something in the realm of Torah that absolutely blows my mind and is really a total paradigm shift in the way I look at something. And that happened a few weeks ago around the story of Sodom, or Sodom, as some people like to pronounce it. And it's been so on my mind. My family is getting so sick of hearing about it. I keep doing more and more research. And this is the week, this is the Torah portion when we talk about it, Parshat Vayeros. I wanted to go into it and share some of what I've learned. Now, there are a couple different interpretations of the Sodom story. One tends to be very literal. This is what happened. Fire came from heaven and destroyed the city. And I always had kind of a hard time with that because, I've never really experienced anything like that. And that's so far outside of the realm of reality. And there are those that are more metaphorical that I'll go into in a moment that make it sound like, okay, this is all happening in the world of prophetic vision. And you know what? We see things in prophetic vision that don't exactly line up with how things happen in real life. And that's always kind of the position that I had preferred until a few weeks ago. Until a few weeks ago when I started looking at the science and like the astrophysicists are coming out and saying, actually, yes, this ancient city was destroyed by fire in a way that no other city or civilization has throughout history. And I want to take you into some of that science right now and how it really completely shifted my perspective. But first, let's go into that original understanding that I was talking about that I really liked. So here we have a Chagall picture of Abraham greeting these three angels or these three travelers. So the story starts at the beginning of the parsha in a very funny way. Abraham has just circumcised himself. He's in a lot of pain at the moment, and God is visiting with him. And then Abraham sees these three people coming up the road, and Abraham runs towards them. And this leads to the old Hasidic story, Vort, idea that, this is how important it is to be having guests in your home. You see Abraham left visiting with God to go greet these people on the road. Doesn't that just show how much more so we should be having people over into our homes and being a good host to those who need a place to go? But I like the Rambam's perspective on this better, or at least I had for many, many years. When the Rambam says that God is visiting Abraham, and then it says, and behold, three people are coming up the road. What does this mean? This means that God comes to visit Abraham, i.e., Abraham entered into the prophetic state. And what is Abraham seeing in that prophetic state? These three people coming up the road. So Abraham, at this point, is going to be unconscious, according to the Rambam, who says that only Moses of all the prophets was able to remain conscious while getting a prophetic vision. So Abraham is now on his floor, unconscious, and in his mind, he sees these three people coming up the road. And of course, they tell him about how he's going to have a child, and they tell him about the destruction of the city of Sodom, and they go off and then destroy this city and bring Lot out of the city. And we all know the story. His wife turns into a pillar of salt. This is all happening according to the Rambam in this prophetic vision. Then we see that Abraham stands up and he looks down upon the destruction of Sodom. He sees like this whole burning furnace area. And that is really when Abraham wakes up from the prophecy. And then we see the whole thing with Lot conceiving with his two daughters, which is outside of the prophecy. So the prophecy is from the moment the three people come towards him, these three angels are walking towards him, and it ends at the time that Abraham stands up after Lot's wife has been turned into a pillar of salt, and everything in between that is just in the state of vision. Because, of course, fire doesn't really come down from heaven, right? Well, wrong, actually. And this is what I learned a couple of weeks ago. And it's just been absolutely blowing my mind ever since. This article, by the way, is from Forbes, hardly a, hippy-dippy or religious publication that is now talking about how a massive meteor is now considered to be the source of what destroyed the city of Sodom. There's archaeological digs that have been going on for 15 years. Now we have Sodom is this place that is marked here as Tel El Hammam. As you can see, it is just on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River Valley. So the Jordan River Valley is coming down here to the Dead Sea. We see Jericho on one side, on the Israel side, and just across there we see the city of Tel El Hammam. And this was a very large ancient city. It was a city that had existed for well over 1,000 years. It was incredibly prosperous, according to the archaeological dig. They're finding, this gigantic palace structure that had been there, that had been existing in this city, and it was an incredibly fertile area. It was considered to be the most fertile area of this whole region of the world, and that overnight it was absolutely destroyed, and wasn't farmed again, wasn't settled again for 700 years, partially because a massive layer of salt was on the destruction. And they're now saying that what destroyed this, it was, in fact, a meteor. Here's a meteor that came, and it was called a meteor burst. So meteors, we sometimes will find these giant craters on the ground. We say, the dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteor, and it'll create this incredible crater. But that's not always what happens with the meteors. This here is a picture from Tunguska up in Siberia in 1908. And this was an area that was considered to be totally destroyed by a meteor blast, a meteor coming into the atmosphere and exploding. The meteors come in and they get super heated up in the atmosphere and then explode above the Earth. It's not going to leave a crater, but it's going to wreak total destruction. And this blast in Siberia is our evidence of what happens when you will have a giant blast like that happening in the atmosphere. And it just wiped out like thousands of acres. You just see tons of trees just absolutely destroyed, everything leveled by this meteor. Now that's what science is now saying happened in the city of Sodom. They say a meteor between 60 and 70 meters across came down and exploded in the air above the city. Now I looked it up. Meteors of this size strike the Earth anywhere on the entire Earth about once every 1,000 to 2,000 years. I'm sorry, not even hit the Earth, but just explode in the atmosphere once every 1,000 to 2,000 years. And how many places in the world, how many human habitations throughout human history have been destroyed by a meteor like this? Well, current archaeology is saying only one. Only Sodom and its surrounding towns have been destroyed by that. There's no evidence of any other human civilization ever being hit. And by the way, the archaeologists, the people who are doing the dating on that, even the secular teams who are not buying the biblical story at all, are saying that it happened between 36 and 3,700 years ago, exactly at the time of Abraham and Lot. So we see that the scientific and the biblical are really lining up in this instance. Now here's an image that really blew me away. So these are two different rocks here. This is here on the left is a rock, and this on the right is a piece of pottery, I believe. And they both have the exact same scenario to them. As you can see, they both have this kind of melted green glass-like surface, and they've also got these white spots from calcium. And if you look on the back of them, you'll also see these black marks of carbon on them. And this is something called trinitite on the left. Trinitite was created, the name comes from the Trinity bomb, the very first controlled nuclear explosion that was done in New Mexico, I believe in the early 1940s. And what happened is like this sudden heating up of this rock caused the whole layer to basically melt. And it caused all these very particular marks to show up on it as it was heated to literally tens of thousands of degrees Celsius instantaneously. And virtually identical patterns were found on this piece on the right. This was a piece of pottery found in the city of Sodom, that in the current archaeological digs that found that exact same thing. The same melted glass surface, the same white marks on the back, the same black scorch marks. And they believe this is exactly the same thing, that this city got heated up to tens of thousands of degrees Celsius instantaneously and then immediately cooled down. They also have found, melted roof tiles and melted bricks, things that only happen with an incredible amount of heat. And they have found gigantic layers of ash in the destroyed area, they found the sheared walls. They basically found like there's a certain level of the city of Sodom that was protected, I guess, by a hillside or something. And so the blast could only go to a certain height. And they found just wall after wall after wall sheared off at exactly that height. So you had this city that was very built up, that had this massive palace. It was many times bigger than the city of Jerusalem, the ancient city of Jerusalem, and the most successful, wealthy place in the area. And you just see all of these totally sheared off walls in the places where this blast just rolled across the entire area, and gigantic levels of ash and destruction. The other thing that is really fascinating about this is that the whole area was covered in salt. So here you had the most fertile area in the region, an incredibly wealthy area, just like our biblical sources say that Sodom was it. Sodom was the most lush place. And I always had a hard time with that, because I'd go down to the Dead Sea area and I'd see, this place is like, how can you grow anything? This must be just, part of this myth, right? Well, no, the archaeology is showing this was inhabited for a really long time and was incredibly lush and fertile. It was being watered by the Jordan River, just above the Dead Sea. But from the time of the destruction, for the next 700 years, nobody resettled and replanted this area. Why? Because the blast also covered the area in a giant layer of salt, which made the ground impossible to reseed and just destroyed the fertility of the ground, destroyed the ability to be growing anything there. And so later, the Greeks, Romans returned to this place. It became a lush area again after the salt was kind of dissipated, but it was just covered in a whole layer of salt. Which also got me thinking, by the way, about the story of Lot's wife. And here it is, the whole family is escaping, and they're told not to turn around. And all of a sudden, one person turns back, and she gets turned into a pillar of salt. It's like, pillar of salt, really? That's what happens here? It made a lot of sense in the Rambam, Maimonides' idea of the prophetic vision that is not actually meant to be like, in reality, that it's all in the kind of language of dreams. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But the idea that somebody would be turned into a pillar of salt, well, actually, it is saying that when the blast came, where did all the salt come from? It came from just this massive amount of either the Dead Sea, either hitting the Dead Sea, or they exploded in midair. Just the incredible heat just caused the Dead Sea water just rise up and spray out across this region and cover it in salt. So if you imagine this family going up in kind of the shelter of the mountains where they're protected by the blast, and one person coming out of the shelter and looking down, just as this massive wave of salt hit the whole surrounding area, it's like, okay, well, maybe that's what is being described here. Somebody could literally turn into a pillar of salt because this massive wave of salt that coated the entire ground and like inches of the stuff came and hit when this blast arrived. There's also a bunch of evidence that, they found skulls and such that showed the cause of death being little kind of like penny-sized pellets hitting them from the sky. So again, the blast comes, the meteor comes, explodes, and it rains down rock and minerals and salt, all comes and rains down upon the city. That is the current theory of what had destroyed the city of Sodom. And we can go, I was actually in touch with I wrote to the archaeologist, I want to go and see if I can participate in the dig for a few days over in Jordan. It is an ongoing dig. People can go and visit it now. It is literally just over the Jordan River. It's actually very close to the current crossing point between Israel and Jordan, and you can go there. It's not that far of a trip, and if COVID makes it a little bit difficult with traveling, but hopefully we'll be able to work that out. I really want to go and actually see it and see some of these finds and see some of these places where it's scorched. And to me, it's just absolutely amazing that how much one of the biblical stories that seemed so far outside of the realm of scientific possibility, we're suddenly being told, no, this is actually what happened scientifically. Now, of course, the secular scientists who look at this say the thing happened opposite wise. They say, okay, we now see evidence that a massive meteor blast destroyed all of these cities. That probably gave birth to the myth of Sodom, of this whole of God destroying the city from above. That was the actual physical reality, probably led to the creation of the biblical myth story. Those of us who are on the observant side, say, well, yeah, isn't that a nice convenient way to line things up? That you're now saying that this biblical story that always said could never actually have happened in reality. You're now saying, okay, it happened in reality, but no, the reality brought about the myth rather than it actually being a reflection of what actually, the biblical story going through the whole encounter and then and it actually lining up with reality. So you can take it either way, whether you believe that the destruction of the city by a meteor with fire coming from the heavens inspired a myth, or as the story says, God decided to destroy the city and so brought fire from the heavens. But right now, the science and the biblical story are absolutely lining up in ways that I never thought would be possible. And to me, I find it really inspiring. I find it incredibly cool that science has the ability to even dig into these sites and discover such evidence of this incredible destruction that happened so many thousands of years ago, and that happened exactly at the time of Lot and Abraham.